And I think that's a good segue for our next conversation with Jane Wales and Paige Rice. And Jane is the Vice President of the Aspen Institute, and she's the Executive Director of the Program on Philanthropy and Social Innovation at the Institute. She's also the co-chair of the Generosity Commission. Jane has a very impressive resume that extends over many decades. She's worked in significant security roles for 2 United States presidents in 2 different administrations. And she also has led significant security roles in 2 major philanthropic organizations. I've gotten to know Jane over the last 5 or 6 years. Before she began her work at the Generosity Commission, we would have conversations about what the state of giving is in the United States. And then I look up and she's taken action to start the Generosity Commission work, which has now spanned over a couple of years. And I can tell you that a lot of people are putting a lot of thought into this issue. And we're all just thankful, really, for Jane and her Herculean efforts to keep that group together, focused, and producing some results, which I'm sure you're going to see very soon. And Paige Rice is she's a researcher for Hathaway Communications. She's the director of Hathaway Communications. And they've worked alongside of the Generosity Commission. But Paige has worked extensively in brand, message, and audience research. She has a variety of nonprofit issue advocacy, labor union, and corporate clients on her list of organizations that she's working with. Prior to working with Hathaway, she worked on public affairs at SKDK, and she also has a master's degree in international development from the University of Amsterdam. So we have an international person here along with us there. So I'm going to ask these 2 wonderful heroines to come up and take on this next part of this work. Thank you.
We're supposed to come up here. Is that right?
You are.
We start up here?
Wherever
one. So I guess the lesson of your introduction, and first of all, thank you for that introduction, but the lesson is watch out for a meeting or conversation with art because it always leads to action. So, keep that awareness in your electronic calendar. So I'm going to start on a somewhat different angle and then ask get a sense whether you're like me in the following sense, that no matter who wins the elections in November, we're worried about the fate of the system we built for self-governance. We're worried about social cohesion. And when I think about the system we built, I think about sort of 2 core attributes of liberal democracy. The first being a commitment to pluralism, that sense that we are all able to celebrate our own culture, our own traditions, to do so peacefully and proudly within the context of a commitment to a larger shared society, a larger shared polity, the democracy. So that's sort of kind of the sine qua non of a liberal democracy and of our democracy. The second is much more of a structural one, and that is the notion that self-governance involves all 3 sectors. It's the public sector, it's the private sector, it's the social sector. Each has a role. And that is one of the things, first place, that brings us all together and inspires our work. But it is also the system we built when it came to our democracy. Having said that, I think that civil society is our singular asset. Other countries are now growing in their civil society, but this has been a part of us from the get-go. And as that civil society is powered by engaged citizens. These are volunteers, these are givers, these are folks that put coins in the collection plate or in the Salvation Army kettle. See, we have the Salvation Army here. They're the folks who support the local, sort of women's shelter or mentor struggling youth. They're the folks that show up in Vermont to the town hall meetings actually to listen with the notion and understanding that compromise is not the same as capitulation. It's self-governance. And so when we think about the everyday giver and everyday volunteer, we think about the folks that are powering our democracy in so many ways, and in fact ensuring the promise of pluralism and ensuring a system of self-governance that makes sense and is inclusive. Having said that, I'm scared. First time in my life that I've actually been frightened about the sustainability of a system of which we're a part. We know it works, and in fact, we love it. We love the diversity within it. I also, struck by the fact just the last 2 days of what comes through on my email is the fact that when it comes to these small, many of the folks that are powering this, they're powering our democracy through often very small community-based organizations. And it was interesting to find, I guess it was today or yesterday, the announcement that Mackenzie Scott has now made a series of $2 million grants to small organizations in multiple states, and done so in collaboration with Lever for Change and innovation in our field. But we always think of, I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself, but I always think of the billionaire class, the large foundations, as having the capacity to solve really big problems. Bill Gates can invest in mRNA technology, and it turns out to be the platform for our COVID vaccine. That's the category of solving really big problems. I think of small grassroots organizations and those givers and volunteers that support them. They're building the capacity to solve within our society. And so they are as essential, as important, in many ways more important than these large, impressive gifts that we all applaud and all hope to get. There is an enormous value, and so that is why we're concerned. Moving to the concern, I'm supposed to do this. I already talked about them. I would just say that it's in these organizations, in these forums, that democratic decision-making is actually practiced in our country, where problems are solved, where shared resources are stewarded, and where bucket brigades, whether literal or metaphorical, tend to be mobilized. And the engagement of individuals is what builds trust. It's what builds community and what builds that capacity to solve. So that's why we get really worried when you find these extraordinary drops over decades in the participation of everyday givers and everyday volunteers. I suspect that the only person who gets quoted more than Richard Edelman today is John. Because it is the data, the really remarkable research they do with Giving USA, following the trends of formal giving to nonprofits, and showing us where that is dropping off, and dropping off in a very large way. So we're worried. And that is the reason the Generosity Commission was created. As you may know, Giving USA is supported by the Giving Institute. And in response to the kinds of drop-offs that we're seeing, these 20 million households right after or soon after the Great Recession dropping out and not coming back. It is just the whole notion that with some blips, year over year, more money is given by fewer givers, and year over year, more volunteer hours are donated by fewer volunteers. Back to my sort of democracy argument, that's frightening when you have both the concentration of wealth, which is in itself troubling, a shrinking middle class, which is not only bad for people, bad for democracy, but you also might be facing, it just begs the question, I don't know the answer, we want to learn it with Paige's help, but begs the question of whether there is also a concentration of agency, a concentration of that sense of having a role, having a stake in our society, and having the capacity to make a difference. And you have to ask the question, or at least I have to ask the question, when that sense of agency goes, what does that mean in a system of governance that's supposed to be by, for, and of the people? What might that mean? We have, it was out of a concern about the sort of what these trends suggest, what they augur for the resilience of our society, but also the strength of our democracy. So as I say, John, Una, all his colleagues at Giving US, at the Lilly School, have produced the kind of data that force us to ask those kinds of questions. Giving Institute built up the commission with the idea of asking us to both celebrate the role of the everyday giver, the everyday volunteer, but also to illuminate the role they play in our society, their significance. Because I think it's one of those things like oxygen. You don't notice a drop-off in civil society unless you have it, or the benefits of civil society, unless you start to lose it. So Asha is on the Giving, on the Generosity Commission with me. Art is co-chair of its policy task force, along with John Tyler, and several of you have contributed in a variety of ways. I just remember sitting down at one point when talking to Asha, and I said, you know, let me just think for a moment about my own life. I was born in a nonprofit hospital. My mother's life was saved by that nonprofit hospital when it turned out she had cancer. I learned how to swim at the Jewish Community Center, even though I'm a Protestant. Nobody checked that at the door. Nobody cared. They just saw a 4-year-old who loved water. Can go on and on and on when you think about, you know, that only brings me to age 4, by the way. And according to Art, I've been around for many, many decades. So think of the impact on our lives. But finally, we were asked to try to reverse those trends, to make recommendations to policymakers, business leaders, to nonprofit innovators and foundations, make recommendations as to how to encourage, enable, help along a return to everyday giving and everyday volunteering. I keep forgetting this. Let me just say. So the way we've gone about it, should say that we did start with that question of, you know, the hypothesis of why, and identified basically 2. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. But 2, you know, the sort of the most popular reason is to say it's about economics. And I think what's striking about this is that sense of precarity, whether or not you're doing well financially, that sense that any minute that could change. Any minute. You know, my parents are of the Depression generation. My father, for 16 years of his life, was quite comfortable. Suddenly, he had to support his parents because of the Depression. He always, for the rest of his life, thought the Great Depression was coming around the corner tomorrow. Buying a new pair of shoes was an argument in our household because the Great Depression is about to come tomorrow. There's a similar sense of precarity now. And so that's one of those reasons. But the second is what I've mentioned before, and that's that sense of, you know, sort of understanding that all of these trends happen alongside 2 other trends. One being the rise in social isolation, and the other decline in societal trust. And so our sense is that it's a more complicated picture. We undertook, and I'm going to do this real quick, but 3 So we took testimony, we had listening sessions with a wide variety of people, and we underwrote three or four big pieces of original research, and we're always guided by the Lilly School as well. Very quickly, the first piece of research was by Urban Institute, George Mason University, American University, independent sector. We asked them, what are the subsectors most harmed by a dropped-off in everyday givers? And our fears were realized. It is the small, nonprofit, community-based nonprofit, people-serving nonprofit that so rely on volunteers and so rely on small gifts of $500 or less. The second big piece of research we underwrote was by Lucy Bernholtz at Stanford. And what she found is what Asha already knew, and many people in this room already knew because they're part of that movement. And that is the process of a reimagination of philanthropy, of volunteerism, of community, and that's happening before our very eyes. And understanding that better is going to be all important if we actually want to understand the fate of generosity in our country. And there I would think about, well, two things I would just say about that. The first is that our first recommendation, or the first thing we sort of say in our report, and you'll see in September, is that the job of tracking and analyzing giving in all its forms is all important. and we really applaud the work of Giving Tuesday and the many folks they've assembled in setting out to do that. What we also will say, however, is that there is the civic impact of each kind of giving is different, and volunteering is given. So I would say, for example, mutual aid, as old as the hills, but really accelerated by COVID, when the need became so apparent. Mutual aid is engaging. It asks something of the giver. It is, to me, fundamentally supportive of our democracy. Giving to nonprofits, we also feel, strengthens the basis of our democracy. Giving, and we've got PayPal and GoFundMe here. Giving online, giving never meeting the folks, can be only transactional rather than relational. And what's exciting about what we're looking at ahead is that the people who are looking at this question care deeply about that. How do you build community around what appears to be only a transaction? I've also, now Asha, since you're right in front of me, I'm going to keep saying things about you. What I love about Giving Tuesday is not that it's expanding giving or expanding participation. It's that Giving Tuesday has figured out how to build a sense of belonging. And that's all important in our view. So you'll see this reflected ultimately in our recommendations. So let me just skip ahead and say, oh yes, one other big one that we supported was by Nathan Dietz at the Do-Good Institute at University of Maryland. And there we asked him to see whether what was the relationship between the sense of a social connectedness that is engendered by giving and volunteering on the one hand, and other pro-social behavior. Does one lead to another? He can't give us a causal link. We don't know what is caused, what's correlated, what coincides, but we do know that what he has shown us is that pro-social behavior clusters. And my favorite data point from him is that the first-time volunteer is the most likely person to become a first-time voter, to register to vote for the first time. That just gives you one example. I am going to now skip ahead because I've taken too much time. But let me just say that back to that notion of agency. As I said, we don't actually know whether there's a concentration of agency. It is a question, and it's a question that only the everyday givers and volunteers can answer. And that's the importance of How to Ways work, is that they have been taking a look at the mindset of donors and volunteers who are lapsed or who are currently very much engaged, And going forward, after we release our report in September, we will be, first of all, we do not want or expect our report to be the final word on anything, but instead to provoke conversations, to prompt conversations, so that others can come up with far better picture of generosity as we know it, and generosity as it can be going forward. So I want to, Paige, I want to turn to you, because you're going to explain how the heck you do it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paige Rice, and I'm a Director of Research at Hadaway Communications. We are a strategic communications firm who works with foundations and nonprofits that are trying to help people on the planet. So we started working with the Generosity Commission in 2022 in response to the trend of, that we're all talking about here so much, the downward trend in the number of givers donating and volunteering to nonprofits. And so what we were tasked to do was to contribute something really fresh to the field that was sort of a novel and actionable approach to expanding participation, to increasing this this approach so that more people are brought into the fold. And so what we did was we did a audience segmentation that mapped the mindsets around giving and volunteering in the United States. And this was intended to offer really engaging ways to reach your current givers and also to expand that pool of givers with new audiences. So our goal here was to equip philanthropic leaders and others in the field with fresh ways of thinking about their audiences to inspire donor and volunteer participation. So we conducted qualitative and quantitative research that mapped audience mindsets around giving and volunteering and other pro-social activities. So we explored not just the ways in which people practice generosity, but also what does it mean to them, why do they choose to be generous, what are some of the barriers, some of the big things that are getting in the way. And then also, how can we better engage current and potential givers around the things that matter most specifically to them? And so we conducted a large landscape, media landscape, where we looked at the conversations that were happening in the media around giving and volunteering. We also conducted a large national survey, and then we did focus groups with segments identified in the survey. And then we put together the report, Why and How We Give, which is a super detailed report of the things that you're going to hear today. So I highly encourage everybody to check it out if you find this useful. So all of our work at Hadaway Communications is guided by the aspirational communications model, which is a science-backed framework that helps us communicate with maximum motivating power. So we've pulled together research from cognitive, motivational, and social psychology, and we've seen that you achieve greater interest and engagement when you hit people on all of these different levels. So if you can kind of think about the person that you're really, really trying to engage, what they want, how they want to show up in the world, what they want to accomplish, what they want the world to look like, these are kind of the things that we're trying to get to through this aspirational model. So on the aspirational level, we're speaking to people's hopes and values, what they aspire for the world to look like in the future. So for example, is this person really driven by greater social justice in the world? On the social level, we are looking at putting people into the picture. So how can we make it really clear? How can we help people envision themselves or people like them in donating and volunteering and working with your causes? And then on the emotional level, we're speaking to the head and the heart. This is where this issue of trust really comes in. What role does trust play in how people engage with nonprofits? What role does skepticism play? And then finally, on the functional level, we want to offer a lot of value that people really understand. So again, here we can kind of get into the self-efficacy, agency of, how do we show people that actually they can make a difference in a tangible way. So just to give you kind of a little taste of what we did and what we learned, we conducted this large audience segmentation, which is intended to get us all out of sort of the traditional ways of thinking about our audiences, and break some of these habits that haven't been working. And so we're not looking at people by their demographics or by their party identification, but rather by their unique motivations, attitudes, and concerns. So if we think about Gen Z, for example, a lot of people in this room are talking about motivating younger givers to give. Gen Z is a huge demographic with lots of different aspirations and attitudes. So here, Gen Z falls into all of these categories that you're going to see clustering sort of in certain ones. But it's a way to really drill in not just to the demographic, but to the actual aspirations that they have. And so this helps us tailor messages and engagement strategies that are going to break through the noise and that are going to capture attention and motivate people to act. So we asked over 50 mindset questions, and people were asked on a scale of 1 to 7 whether or not they agree or disagree with this statement as it relates to themselves and the world. And these were all questions that were sort of clustered around giving, volunteering, and other civic engagement and pro-social behaviors. So some examples of this, of what we asked are, I see myself as a very religious person. Everyone in this room knows that religiosity is a very important piece of the puzzle when it comes to generosity. So we wanted to see how that played a role in the different mindsets. We also asked, voting is my civic duty. Obviously a very big focus for the Generosity Commission. So we wanted to see how civic engagement really played out in these different mindsets and how we could, in certain places, kind of drill into that feeling. And then finally, ordinary people like me can't give enough money to make a real difference. And this one really gets into that sense of agency that Jane was talking about, as well as the economics. One of the largest barriers we've seen, or the largest barrier we see, is people not having enough money and then not having enough time. And so how do we show people that they can actually create a difference even just by giving in small amounts, and that the act of giving, the act of volunteering is what matters? So these are our 6 segments that we identified along with the share of the population. Super givers are, the name probably speaks for itself. They're the group of people that everyone in this room, I think, is probably really familiar with. It's probably really easy for you to engage these folks. They have both the combination of the desire to be generous and also the means and the time. So they really make it a big priority for themselves. Then there's these 3 audiences next to them: the connection seekers, the next generation doers, and the civic-minded hopefuls. I'm going to table those for a second because we're going to go into detail on those a bit more. And then you have the show me scrutinizers and the apathetic non-givers. So the show me scrutinizers, they do give, but it's just not a huge priority for them, and they do a lot of their giving specifically through their church. This group is really, really skeptical of philanthropy, and they're not really looking to expand their generosity. They're not really looking to find new causes. They're kind of set in their ways. They're a little bit older. So we don't see this as a great new audience to target, but these people might fall into some of your current givers. And then the apathetic non-givers, again, I think that name speaks for itself. These folks are, they're not giving, they're not making it a priority, they're not volunteering, and they're also not engaged in other pro-social behaviors. They're the least likely to vote. So, they're sort of the 20% of the population that you're probably not that interested in engaging. But one of the really promising findings of this is that there actually is 80% of the population that wants to give and wants to donate. So looking at the three in the middle, that kind of 50% that we're seeing as the low-hanging fruit for engagement, these folks are ambivalent, so they hold positive attitudes, or they have some sort of, or they're taking positive actions, but they have something else that's sort of getting in the way, or they have some barrier to being as generous as they'd really like to be. And so we want to think through, like, how can we lean into those positive attitudes and also overcome some of those barriers. So talking about these a little bit more and kind of giving you all some like tangible ideas of what this engagement might look like. So starting with the connection seekers, I know Jane talked quite a bit about building community through generosity, and it's a topic of conversation later. This particular group is really, really invested in building community. And so they are looking for fun and engaging activities that help them build that sense of community. And so beyond kind of the obvious, putting together fun activities for them, I think you want to think through ways to make them feel like they can build a community through you. So one example of that is I see myself as a connection seeker. And a couple years ago, I was moving from Washington, D.C. to Brooklyn, and I threw myself a going away party so I could see all of my friends before I left. And I decided to make it a fundraiser for one of the local DC organizations that I really liked as sort of a final send-off. And so everybody came, donated $10 to $20, small amounts, but we ended up raising a couple $100, and we got to have a really fun party out of it too. So you can kind of see how you're showing how small amounts can ladder up to a larger amount, and also how you can build community through giving. And then the next group is next generation doers. This group is the youngest of all the groups, for just kind of to keep in mind. They see themselves as leaders, but they're really looking for a lot of recognition, and they tend to think that giving and volunteering is sort of a self-interested act. And they really want a lot of like education and context. So they're super curious, and they want to take leadership roles. So, one way you can kind of lean into this idea that they want to take on leadership roles is to allow them to really be a leader within your organization and to give them some recognition. So one example we heard recently about this was there was a local trail cleanup crew who had a high school student who kept showing up, and she was really eager to help. And so they kind of saw that she really wanted to take a leadership role, and so they gave her a little reflected vest, took some photos of her, posted it on their Twitter, introducing her as their new student leader, and it really was exciting for her. And her dad, reached out and said, like, she loved this. This was the best thing you could have done. And they probably made the lifelong volunteer, maybe not for them, but just generally, this girl now is so motivated to volunteer because she's really seen herself as a leader. And then the final group is the civic-minded hopefuls. And this group, they really are invested in civil society and democracy. They really want a just world, and they are super civically engaged, interested in civic action. But even with that civic engagement, they still sort of feel stuck sometimes and unsure how they can actually make a difference. And so, we want to show them how, by coming together, even small acts of pursuing your passions and your values can really ladder up to movement building. So one example of this was we heard about an environmental justice organization who, at the beginning of their training sessions, they would have everybody stand around and say, the reason why they were there, what their values were that brought them to be in that space. And what that did was it allowed everybody to really connect on their shared values around social justice, and also see the way that all of their passions could ladder up into a larger movement. So that was kind of just a little taste of what we learned. There's a ton more in the report. Probably all of you can start to think about how these people might fit into your some of the audiences that you're trying to reach. So hopefully we got some of the creative juices flowing. And I will be around, so if anyone has questions, feel free to chat me up or email me later. And yeah.
So we're going to take can we take 1 second, because there was a lot. Can we I know I'm off script here, but does anybody have like a question that they're really burning to ask? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, just seeing the different categories from the super givers to the apathetic non-givers. You know how when we're all trained as change agents and change makers, right? And we know that there's 3 buckets of people. People who are our allies and are ready to go. People in the middle, where majority of us fall, and then the X's, like you can't change their mind. So are there buckets of are the civic-minded hopefuls towards the middle, where we kind of have to convince them a little bit, and different engagement strategies compared to the, super givers and connection seekers and next generation doers? I'm just trying to find ways to understand where to put them in my head.
Okay, so I think one thing is the purpose of this segmentation is to stop thinking about people in those really those 3 different categories, and start to kind of think about new ways of thinking about your audiences. But if we were going to categorize them, I think we would sort of put the connection seekers and the civic-minded hopefuls in sort of that middle category of the folks that you need to kind of maybe put a little bit more effort in engaging and convince a little bit. Not that they need to be convinced that.
No, understood. I just didn't know which ones to put in the middle bucket for strategies.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
All right, one more. Anybody? Yes.
Thank you. That was super fascinating. Also, as a fellow social science researcher, that I wanted to snap the whole time. One question that I have for you is, you have all of this great research, you have all these insights. How can nonprofits sort of leverage that information, right? They don't have a list of their donors segmented by this. So how can you make that sort of classification more actionable?
Yeah, so on a functional level, we can help you classify those people. So we have something called a typing tool, where we take the 15 questions that were the greatest predictors of a segment, and we can do a survey with your email list and actually overlay that. It's something that we've done for one of the major universities recently and have gotten really good results. And then that is one of the challenges when it comes to these, if you don't have that kind of information. So I think part of it is creating lots of different opportunities, thinking about who do you really want to engage, and then creating these opportunities that will attract the different segments. And as you get to know people, you'll understand, who is looking for leadership versus who just kind of wants to show up and make friends. But kind of by creating those different points of engagement that get outside of just kind of the normal ways that we're engaging, I think that and broadening your engagement strategies, you'll start to draw in some of these different folks.
Thank you. Sorry, I know there was a lot more you could ask, but we're just kind of out of time. As you can see from that presentation, there's a lot of information that will be coming out from Generosity that can help us think differently about how to engage people in giving, especially giving to institutions. I encourage you all to pay close attention to the report when it comes out, and also to find ways to engage your organizations in the recommendations that come out. Or if you disagree with them, let's say something about that too. As Jane said, we don't think we're going to be the last word on this, but I do hope that it stimulates a real conversation that leads to change as relates to donating in this country. I also would want to offer thanks to Jane for holding up this idea that giving is part of our American tradition and a key piece of our American democracy. And I don't think we talk about that enough. I think there's a whole generation, or maybe even people from our current generations, who don't get that. But it is so critical that people appreciate the role that nonprofits and private agents play in holding up our democracy. And we have to begin talking about that more. We have to begin realizing that more. It's not simply the work that you are able to accomplish in your organization. It's the fact that you're attempting to do it with other people who want to see change.